It was during a damp and listless October that I found myself once again in the company of Hercule Poirot, that remarkable little Belgian whose genius had long been my source of admiration, bafflement and, if I am honest, mild exasperation. I had returned to London after an extended stay in Bath, hoping for a bit of routine and perhaps the occasional dinner with my old friend. I certainly did not anticipate being swept into another of his dazzling adventures. Poirot had taken to a somewhat leisurely schedule, enjoying his comforts, his tisane, his patent leather shoes, his precision-cut mustaches, with great regularity. But as I well knew, Poirot could never resist the call of a truly interesting mystery, particularly one that defied conventional logic. We were just settling down at his flat in Whitehaven Mansions for a game of chess, which he always won, regardless of my efforts, when the telephone rang. Poirot answered it with his usual elegance, and within a minute the game was forgotten. His eyes glinted with interest, and I knew that his little grey cells had been stirred. "Mon ami," he said, hanging up the receiver with great deliberation, "how do you feel about the countryside in Kent? A most intriguing crime has occurred. Curious, très curieux." "A murder?" I asked, reaching instinctively for my coat. "Not exactly, at least not yet. But a letter has been found. A most disturbing letter, one which may be either a confession, a literary hoax, or an invitation to murder. Diamonds." We arrived at the estate of Eleanor Forsyth 2 hours later, a genteel sprawl of Tudor brick and ivy-choked windows nestled within the Kentish hills. Miss Forsyth, we learned, was one of Britain's most celebrated mystery novelists and had hosted a small gathering at her country home for the weekend. A literary retreat of sorts, consisting of her editor, a rival novelist, her secretary, and a young couple she had recently taken under her wing. But the weekend retreat had ended with anything but literary acclaim. She was found unconscious in her study yesterday evening. Inspector Cottrell of the Kent Police told us in a tone that hovered somewhere between bemusement and unease. "Apparently fell down the stairs. Nothing suspicious at first glance. But then the housemaid found this." He handed Poirot a sheaf of typewritten pages, stapled neatly at the corner. The title on the front read, "My Final Confession, A True Account of Murder, by Eleanor Forsyth." Poirot's brow arched, and he turned to the inspector with a mixture of delight and concern. "Ah, so the victim is a novelist, and she writes a confession. How very modern, and how very dangerous." We read the pages in silence. They were unmistakably in Forsyth's voice, crisp, confident, and chilling. The confession detailed the poisoning of a man named Patrick Linton, allegedly committed 6 years ago in Florence. The narrative was calm, even clinical, and ended with an ominous flourish. "Let my conscience rest now. If justice comes, so be it." But Patrick Linton, we learned, had indeed died in Florence under suspicious circumstances. His death had been ruled accidental, but whispers of scandal had followed. Eleanor Forsyth had been living there at the time. The connection was more than suggestive. "Could it be a fictional story?" I asked as Poirot carefully smoothed out the last page. "No, Hastings. It is too precise, too direct. No names changed, no artistic flair. This is not literature, it is confession, or at the very least a most dangerous game." "And now she lies unconscious?" "Oui. An accident, perhaps, or perhaps someone feared what she had written." Poirot glanced at the house, its windows dark, its chimneys coughing smoke into the grey sky. "Let us begin, Hastings. Somewhere inside that house is a person who knows the truth, and perhaps fears it." As we stepped across the threshold of Eleanor Forsyth's estate, a curious hush seemed to envelop the place, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Poirot paused in the entryway, his eyes darting from the ornate coat-stand to the scuffed edges of a Persian rug. "Do you observe, Hastings? This is a house accustomed to order. And yet, see there, The marks upon the floor where the umbrella stand has been moved, recently and with haste. Someone here has been uneasy." I made no reply, for just then a woman descended the stairs with a slow and guarded gait. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, sharply dressed, with a tight coil of hair and an expression that would not have looked out of place on a magistrate. She introduced herself as Miss Judith Larkin, Eleanor's personal secretary. "You must be Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a hand without warmth. "Miss Forsyth is resting. The doctor insists she needs quiet. A mild concussion, some bruising. She is lucky it wasn't worse." "May we see her?" Poirot asked gently. Miss Larkin shook her head. "Dr. Fenwick has asked that she not be disturbed, at least not until tomorrow. He was most firm about it." Poirot gave a small nod, accepting this, at least for the moment. "Then perhaps, mademoiselle, you will do us the kindness of assembling those who were present this weekend. I would like to understand precisely what occurred, hour by hour. Of course, they are all still here. No one has left." "Ah," Poirot murmured with satisfaction. "Good. Then we are in the company of either an anxious group of innocents or a very nervous murderer." Miss Larkin didn't flinch, though I saw the slightest tightening at the corners of her mouth. We were shown to the drawing room, a low-ceilinged affair filled with bookshelves and cigarette smoke. Within moments, the guests trickled in one by one, each casting curious, wary glances at us. Poirot remained seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth, fingers templed beneath his chin as he observed the group with quiet scrutiny. First came Mr. Leonard Payne, Eleanor Forsyth's editor at Mondrell & Co. He was a tall, austere man with a face lined by what I imagined were years of reading galleys by candlelight. He offered Poirot a brisk nod and took a seat away from the others, arms folded tightly. Next was Miss Cora Blake, a rival novelist of middling fame, known in literary circles for her barbed reviews of Eleanor's work. She was dressed flamboyantly in a velvet shawl and gold bangles that clinked as she moved. She surveyed Poirot with a raised eyebrow, but said nothing. Then came the young couple, Daniel and Eve Markham. They were recent acquaintances of Eleanor's, and she had apparently taken a rather maternal interest in their burgeoning careers. Daniel, a nervous, well-mannered sort with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, offered a strained smile. Eve, by contrast, was striking, poised, sharp-eyed, and holding herself with the composure of someone used to watching rather than being watched. Poirot stood and addressed them. "Mesdames, Messieurs, a terrible thing has happened. Miss Forsyth, your hostess, has been found injured, and in her study we have discovered a manuscript, a most troubling one, a confession, it seems, to the murder of a man named Patrick Linton. Now, before we draw any conclusions, I ask simply this: who here knew of this manuscript before this morning?" A silence followed. It was Leonard Payne who finally spoke. "I saw Eleanor working on something. She said it was a diversion. Something that's been eating at me," were her words. But she didn't share the contents. "Did she seem distressed while writing it?" Poirot asked. Payne frowned. "No, oddly enough. If anything, she seemed relieved. Lighter than she had in months." Cora Blake snorted. "It's a publicity stunt, surely. Eleanor always had a flair for the dramatic. The Florence business was ancient history. Linton was a drunk. He fell off a balcony, and the Italian authorities closed the case. End of story. But Miss Forsyth was there at the time, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot asked mildly. "Yes, but so were dozens of others. They were all attending some arts conference or another. It wasn't just Eleanor." Eve Markham shifted in her seat. "She told me about him once. Said he was a dark chapter, someone she couldn't quite forget." Daniel Markham added quietly, "She called it unfinished business. Said she never really knew if it was guilt she felt or simply doubt." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and walked slowly to the window, looking out into the mist-thick garden beyond. And the night before last, was there anything unusual? Anything that struck you as odd or out of place?" Miss Larkin answered this time. "Eleanor dined with all of us, then retired to the study. She said she needed to finally get something down. That must have been when she wrote the pages. The next morning I found them on her desk. She was lying at the foot of the stairs. And the study? It is above? No, it's on the ground floor, but the staircase she was found at leads to the gallery above. We assumed she had gone up to fetch something and slipped on the way down." Poirot turned. "Why did no one hear her fall?" Again, silence. Then Payne replied, "We were outside. It was warm for October. We took drinks on to the terrace." Poirot gave a small nod and sat again. "Then, if you please, I would like to see the study." Miss Larkin led the way, and we followed her through a corridor lined with paintings and portraits. The study was neat, immaculately so. Poirot moved through it with delicate precision, stopping at the desk where the manuscript had been found. He traced his fingers along the edges of a blotter, adjusted the angle of a pen holder, then turned toward a small cabinet in the corner. It was locked. Miss Larkin produced a key from her pocket. Eleanor was particular about her things. Inside were stacks of correspondence, several notebooks, and a worn leather folder marked Florence, 1919. Poirot's eyes glinted. He opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, black and white, showing a villa, a group of men and women laughing at a long banquet table, and in the center of one photo, a man with a sharp nose and sardonic expression. "Patrick Linton," Larkin confirmed. "That's him." Poirot studied the image for a long moment. Then he replaced it and shut the folder. "Tell me, mademoiselle," he said quietly, "was anything else missing from this room?" She hesitated. "Not that I noticed, but the manuscript, it had no signature, no date, and that was unlike her. Eleanor signed everything." "Interesting," Poirot murmured. "Very interesting." As we left the study, Poirot did not speak until we were back in the corridor. "Hastings, mon ami," he said softly. "There is something wrong here. Something subtle, like the wrong note in a familiar melody. The confession, it is too clean, too finished. You think she didn't write it?" "Oh, she wrote it. But whether it was meant as a true confession or something else entirely, that is what we must discover. And quickly. Because someone in this house has been pretending to wait for justice, when, in truth, they may be trying to outrun it." I felt a chill pass through me. Poirot's eyes, dark and glittering, did not waver from the door behind which Eleanor Forsyth still lay, silent and unconscious. "Come, Hastings," he said. "The murderer, I believe, has already played their hand. We must now watch who tries to fold." We returned to the drawing room as the afternoon light waned into the soft grey of early evening. Poirot was uncharacteristically silent, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, his eyes scanning the floor as though tracking a scent. I could see the rhythm of thought ticking behind his stillness, the meticulous sifting of inconsistencies and small details. The suspects remained where we had left them, though now the atmosphere had thickened perceptibly. Conversations had given way to furtive glances, the kind shared by people who know something dark lingers among them but cannot agree on what it is. Poirot sat down and steepled his fingers. "I would like, if you permit me, to speak to each of you alone. There are questions, yes, but also impressions. It is not only what is said, but how it is said that interests Hercule Poirot." Leonard Payne was the first to be summoned. He entered the small parlor just off the drawing room and sat across from Poirot with the posture of a man used to arguments and deadlines. "Monsieur Payne," Poirot began, "you say Miss Forsyth was relieved, almost light-hearted, before she completed this manuscript. Were you not curious as to why?" Payne shrugged. "Eleanor was a private woman, I learned long ago not to pry when she was in the midst of a new idea. If I asked too many questions, she'd retreat. Best to wait for the final draft. Did she ever mention Patrick Linton? Only obliquely. She referred to Florence now and then. Said she'd done something once she regretted. But it never seemed criminal. At worst, personal. And you, monsieur, do you regret anything where Miss Forsyth is concerned? That drew a flicker of reaction, a tightening around the eyes. I regret that I didn't take her more seriously when she said she had something important to say. I assumed it was another book. I didn't think she meant to implicate herself in a murder. Poirot nodded slowly, then waved him away with a soft merci. Next came Miss Cora Blake. She entered with a faint smirk, clearly less impressed by the proceedings than her predecessor. She took her seat, crossed her legs, and waited with arms folded. Miss Blake, Poirot began, you knew Patrick Linton? Of course I did. Everyone did. He was a parasite, a pretentious bore who spent other people's money and seduced their wives. Florence was teeming with his kind after the war. And Miss Forsyth, what was her relationship with him? That's the question, isn't it? Cora said with a sardonic smile. She was younger then. He charmed her, as he did everyone. But Eleanor was no fool. She saw through people eventually. But not soon enough, perhaps, Poirot said softly. Do you believe she killed him? She could have, Cora said without hesitation. But so could half the people who knew him. Don't mistake me. Eleanor had morals, but they were the kind that shift with necessity. If she did it, I imagine she believed it was justice. Poirot narrowed his eyes. You say that with conviction, yet you suggest the confession is a stunt. Because it is. A brilliant one. That manuscript was timed too perfectly. A writer publishing her own guilt. It's performance art. No one confesses in neat prose and leaves it unsealed on their desk. You think she meant it to be discovered? I think she meant someone to read it and react. Poirot dismissed her gently and asked for the Markhams. Eve came in first. She moved with quiet purpose, her gaze meeting Poirot's directly, almost challengingly. She sat down without being asked. Madame Markham, Poirot said with a polite nod, you were quite close to Miss Forsyth. As close as anyone could be. She was generous, encouraging, but guarded. She spoke in pieces. And did any of those pieces reveal Florence, Patrick Linton? Only once. I asked her what she regretted most in life, and she said, not doing something sooner. I didn't know what she meant until I saw the manuscript. You do not seem surprised by its content. I was, but not shocked. Eleanor had a darkness in her. I always sensed it. You believe it is genuine then? I believe she believed it. Whether that makes it true, I don't know. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And do you? Believe it's true? A pause. Yes, she said finally. But I also believe someone wanted it buried. Poirot made no response, simply gestured for Daniel Markham to be sent in. Daniel looked as though he hadn't slept. His hands trembled faintly as he took the chair across from Poirot. Mr. Markham, Poirot said kindly, I will not keep you long. I only ask, what do you make of all this? I don't know what to think. It doesn't seem real. Eleanor was serene. She had that calm you find in people who've already accepted something. You admired her. Very much. We both did. Poirot nodded. And did she confide in you? Was there anything recently that disturbed her? Only a letter she received last week. I didn't read it, but she seemed unsettled afterward. Do you know who sent it? He shook his head. It came by post. I only noticed because she burned it afterward. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. Ah, she burned it. Yes, in the study. She rarely destroyed correspondence. I thought it odd. Poirot dismissed him then, and turned to me once the door had closed. You see, Hastings, we begin to peel away the layers. What do you make of it all? Each person here has told me something true, but none of them the whole truth. That is as revealing as a lie. And the letter? Vital. A letter that unsettled her, burned in haste. It may have prompted the confession, or perhaps warned her against it. Either way, someone feared its contents. I was about to reply when Miss Larkin reappeared, her face tight with unease. "Mr. Poirot, something's happened." We followed her up the stairs to the guest corridor. Outside one of the rooms, Inspector Cottrell stood with a constable. His expression was grim. "It's Payne," he said. "The maid found him on the floor. Empty bottle of chloral hydrate nearby. Suicide, looks like." Poirot pushed past him into the room. Leonard Payne lay sprawled beside the bed, a glass still clutched in his hand. His features were twisted, not with peace, but with something closer to regret. A note sat on the nightstand. Poirot picked it up, eyes narrowing as he read. "Forgive me. I should have stopped her." That was all. Poirot stared at the words for a long time. Then he folded the note carefully and turned to the inspector. "No, this is no suicide." "But the chloral?" "He was drugged, not by his own hand. Someone wants us to believe the case is over, that guilt has spoken. But I tell you, Inspector, Leonard Payne was not the one who feared that confession." I felt a sudden, awful chill. "Then who did?" I asked. Poirot looked around the room once, then back to the corridor, where shadows stretched across the floor. The person who did not expect Eleanor Forsyth to survive. He stepped out briskly, eyes dark with urgency. "And now, Hastings, we must get to her, at once." We followed Poirot swiftly through the hallways, his patent leather shoes tapping with unusual urgency against the parquet floor. I could barely keep pace with him. His neat silhouette cut sharply against the faded elegance of the corridors, his mind clearly racing ahead of us. "She is in danger, Hastings. Do you not see?" The manuscript was the first move. Payne's death the second. The third, mon ami, may be irreversible. "But who would—" "There is no time for speculation now," he interrupted crisply. "We act." We reached Eleanor Forsyth's door, only to find it ajar. Poirot did not hesitate. He pushed it open with the tip of his cane and stepped inside. Eleanor sat up in bed, wide-eyed but unharmed. A nurse hovered by her side with a tray of medication. Poirot's shoulders, which had been taut with tension, loosened minutely. "Mademoiselle," he said, his voice softening, "you are quite all right." She blinked, confused. "Yes, why? What's happened?" Poirot approached slowly. "Forgive the intrusion. There has been another incident. Monsieur Payne, your publisher, is dead." Her breath caught. She said nothing for a moment. Then, with visible difficulty, "He's dead. We believe he was murdered, made to appear a suicide, because of your manuscript." Eleanor's hands gripped the blanket. "But why would anyone kill Leonard? He didn't write it. He didn't even like it." "Exactly, mademoiselle. He was not its creator, merely its custodian. But he may have known more than he let on. Or perhaps someone feared what he might discover." She looked at him with genuine confusion. "I don't understand. What am I supposed to do?" "Trust me," Poirot said simply. "Tell me, who else knew of this manuscript before this weekend?" "No one," she said after a moment. "Not until I gave it to Leonard. I wanted his opinion. I wanted someone to know before I decided whether to send it." "Send it where?" "To the police." I was ready, I think, but I hesitated. Poirot nodded. "And this letter you received last week, do you recall the sender?" Sighs, she frowned. "I burned it." "Yes, but before you did." "The name?" "No name. It was typed. It just said, 'Don't make a mistake you can't undo.' That's all. No signature, no return address." It frightened me. Poirot stepped back, his eyes narrowing in contemplation. "Of course it did. That was its purpose. He glanced toward the nurse, who was carefully arranging vials on a tray. No visitors for Mademoiselle Forsyth tonight, and none of her medicine is to be given unless personally verified. The nurse nodded, eyes wide. Poirot turned sharply and swept back into the hallway, motioning for me to follow. The danger is real, Hastings. The confession is not merely a provocation. It is a threat to someone who thought the past was buried. But if Eleanor wrote it and admitted to the murder, how can the danger lie elsewhere? Because I do not yet believe she's the guilty party. I stared, but she confessed. In detail. Poirot raised a finger. Details are dangerous things, mon ami. They give the illusion of certainty. But tell me, would a murderer describe their crime with the precision of a novelist, with scenes and dialogue? No, Hastings. The guilty mind evades, conceals, forgets. It does not compose with literary flair. But why would she write it if it wasn't true? To punish herself, to protect someone else, or, perhaps most dangerously, to see who would react. We descended the staircase. The drawing room was quieter now. The guests had dispersed. But Cora Blake stood by the fireplace, a crystal glass in hand. She turned as we entered, her eyes appraising. "You look grim," she said to Poirot. "Did you find her dead too?" Poirot's expression did not change. "No, but someone hoped we might." Cora raised an eyebrow. "And who's that, then?" Poirot stepped closer. Tell me, Miss Blake, did you ever receive correspondence from Patrick Linton before his death?" She gave a short laugh. "Are we back to that scoundrel? I'd have burned anything he sent me." "But did you?" She tilted her head. "What are you suggesting? That you knew more of Linton's dealings in Florence than you have admitted. Perhaps you even shared a secret with him, one that Eleanor stumbled upon." Cora set her glass down with a soft click. "I never shared anything with Linton except contempt." Poirot gave her a small, unreadable smile. "We shall see." He turned away, leaving her fuming behind him. We walked out onto the veranda. The evening air had cooled. Stars pricked the darkening sky. "Hastings," Poirot murmured, "observe the silence of this house. Death has visited twice, and yet they all walk about with secrets stitched into their coats." "I admit," I said, "I'm beginning to suspect nearly everyone." "That is good. But do not confuse suspicion with understanding. We must find the thread that connects Linton's death, the manuscript, and Payne's murder. And to do that, we must revisit Florence." "But we're in Sussex." He gave me a sly look. "Not literally, mon ami. In memory, in reconstruction." We returned to the study, where Poirot began to re-examine the manuscript. He read not for plot, but for omission, for what had been left out. After an hour, he sat back. "There is a person," he said slowly, "whose name is never mentioned in the confession, but whose presence lingers in every paragraph." "Eleanor herself?" "No, a witness. Someone else who was there that night. Someone who saw what happened and ensured it would be misremembered." He tapped the final page. "She says she pushed Linton from the terrace. She says she watched him fall, but there is no mention of how she left, of who helped her, or what happened to the scarf she describes around his neck." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Poirot said grimly, "that Eleanor may not have been alone." Just then, a loud knock rattled the front door. It was Inspector Cottrell, hat in hand. "We've recovered the letter, the one Forsyth said she burned." Poirot's head snapped up. "How?" "It wasn't destroyed after all. Someone retrieved it from the fireplace. It was found in the waste bin, half-burnt but legible." He handed it over. Poirot took the singed page and read, "Eleanor, think carefully. The past does not need to rise again. What was done was necessary. Let it stay buried. Some things do not survive the light. Destroy the manuscript. No name, no address, just a warning." Poirot looked up, his face illuminated by something cold and fierce. "It is not a confession," he said. "It is bait." And in that moment I saw the wheels turn faster than ever before. Someone here feared the past, but not for what they had done, for what Eleanor might remember next. Poirot laid the half-burnt letter flat upon the desk, smoothing its curled edges with delicate fingers. He studied the sharp, mechanical typeface as though it held the fingerprints of the sender in its serifs and spacing. I watched his eyes move over it with the intensity of a chess player reviewing a checkmate sequence he had foreseen 20 moves prior. "Do you notice, Hastings," he murmured, "the subtle construction of menace? The past does not need to rise again. Not should not, but does not need to, as though the sender speaks not only to Eleanor's conscience, but from a shared complicity." He looked up at Inspector Cottrell. "Have you shared this with anyone else?" "Not yet. Found it just before I came." Poirot nodded. "Good. Let us keep it that way. For now. We must preserve the illusion that the writer's message has gone unread." Cottrell's brow furrowed. "You think they'll make another move?" "Mais oui," Poirot replied. "They have no choice. They tried to silence Payne and now Eleanor herself. But the manuscript still exists. I have read it, and they cannot be sure how much I know." The inspector nodded, grimly satisfied, and departed to ensure the remaining staff and guests remained under careful watch. Poirot, meanwhile, turned back to the manuscript, scanning once more the fictionalized account of Patrick Linton's death. "I still do not understand, Poirot," I said. "If Eleanor didn't kill Linton, then who did? And why confess to something so terrible, so definitive?" "Because," Poirot said softly, "guilt is not always born from action, Hastings. Sometimes it comes from inaction, from watching something unfold and choosing to remain silent, from believing that speaking the truth might cause greater harm than living with a lie." I opened my mouth to speak, but he held up a hand. "Come. There is someone we must see." He led me back through the house, our steps echoing in the silent corridors, past ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to watch us with suspicion. We found Lillian Trent, the housekeeper, in the conservatory, watering a cluster of orchids with a mist sprayer. Her expression upon seeing us was perfectly composed, as though she had known we would come. "Madame Trent," Poirot said warmly, "you have managed this house for many years, n'est-ce pas?" 21, sir," she replied. "Since before Miss Eleanor came to live here with her aunt." "Then you knew Patrick Linton well?" Her hand paused mid-spray. "As well as one could. He was often abroad. Reckless sort of man." Poirot inclined his head. "Reckless indeed. Did you like him?" There was a flicker in her eyes. "Not particularly." "And yet you did not speak against him, not even after his death." "It wasn't my place." "But now," Poirot said gently, "it may be the only way to prevent more harm." She set down the sprayer. "What do you want to know?" "Who was here, in the villa, the night Linton died, aside from Eleanor?" She hesitated. "I was. And someone else. Miss Blake." Poirot's brows lifted. "Cora Blake?" "She had come down for the weekend. Patrick invited her." "Yet Miss Blake claims she was in London that week." "She lies," Trent said plainly. "I saw her. She left before the police arrived." Poirot's eyes glittered. "Why would she lie about that?" "I can't say. But she and Mr. Linton were close once. Quarreled often. Perhaps she didn't want her name dragged into the scandal." "Did she quarrel with him that night?" "I don't know. I heard voices, raised, but I stayed to my duties. I didn't see him fall. Only that afterward Miss Forsyth came in, soaked, trembling. She said nothing. Just went to her room. Miss Blake was gone by morning." Poirot bowed slightly. "You have been most helpful." As we stepped away, I whispered, "Do you believe her?" "She has no reason to lie now, and it confirms my suspicion. Eleanor may not have seen everything, or she may have suppressed it. Someone was there, someone who watched Linton fall or helped him fall. That evening, Poirot requested a formal gathering of all the guests and residents. The atmosphere was brittle with tension. Everyone had heard of Payne's death by now, and whispers had begun circulating like wildfire. They assembled in the drawing room, where a fire blazed against the early chill. Eleanor, pale and trembling, but determined, sat upright with folded hands. Beside her, Cora Blake looked cool and composed, though her wine-glass shook slightly. Edwin Ridley, the literary critic, lingered near the window, cigarette dangling nervously from his fingers, and Julian Cavendish, the host, stood near the fireplace with a look of thinly veiled impatience. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I regret that this holiday has taken such a dark turn. One man is dead, another, long buried, has returned to haunt us. And at the center of this storm is a manuscript, a confession, yes, but not, I believe, a truthful one." Murmurs rippled. Cora sat forward. "Are you saying Eleanor lied?" "No, not deliberately. But she wrote what she believed, or what she chose to believe, and therein lies the danger." He turned toward Eleanor. "Mademoiselle, forgive me, but I must ask, why did you write the confession now, after all these years?" Eleanor swallowed. "Because I remembered. I kept dreaming of him falling, the scarf, his voice, and I thought, perhaps I did it. Perhaps I simply buried it so deep I convinced myself I didn't." "And yet you left things out," Poirot said gently. "You never mentioned Cora Blake. You never described what happened after the fall." She frowned. I don't remember." "Then allow me," Poirot said, turning slowly. "Miss Blake, you were in Florence the night Linton died. You argued with him. Witnesses remember. You left the next morning before the authorities could question you." "Why?" Cora laughed, a brittle sound. "Are you serious? What does any of that matter now?" "It matters," Poirot said, "because someone killed Leonard Payne to prevent the truth of that night from surfacing. And I believe you know who." Cora's gaze turned sharp. "Don't look at me." "I must," he replied, "because you had the most to lose. You quarreled with Linton, perhaps about money, perhaps about betrayal. Eleanor's presence was a complication. But when he died, you saw your opportunity. Eleanor had been drinking. She remembered little. You encouraged that confusion, and when she began to remember, you tried to frighten her, to stop her." "I didn't kill Payne," Cora hissed. "No," Poirot agreed. "But I believe you know who did." She stared at him, something shifting behind her eyes. But before she could answer, the door creaked open. It was Julian Cavendish. "I think," he said softly, "it's time I told you everything." Poirot turned, his expression unreadable. "Please, monsieur, the floor is yours." Cavendish stepped forward, his face pale. "Patrick Linton was my brother-in-law. My sister married him in secret years ago. He ruined her, left her. She died penniless while he flaunted wealth he stole from her family. I invited him to Florence to confront him. I was there that night, on the terrace." A hush fell over the room. "I didn't push him," Cavendish continued, "but I saw who did." Poirot nodded once. "And if I guess correctly, it was not Eleanor." "No," Cavendish said, voice breaking. "It was Cora." Cora shot to her feet, but Poirot was already there, blocking her path. Her eyes were wild, her posture taut like a cornered animal. "She confronted him," Cavendish said. He laughed. "She grabbed the scarf and twisted. He stumbled. Fell. I froze." Eleanor appeared moments later. I couldn't let her believe the truth. She was so fragile already. So I let her believe she had caused it. I let the silence protect us." Poirot's voice was soft. "Until now." The room spun in silence. Cora stood trembling. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "He laughed. Always laughing." Poirot looked at her not with anger, but deep sorrow. "It is the laughter of the cruel that haunts most, mademoiselle." He turned to the inspector, who had been quietly summoned. "You may take her now." And with that, the room seemed to exhale. The storm had broken, and what was left was not peace, but truth, raw and cold, but undeniable. As the guests departed and the house fell quiet once more, Poirot remained by the fire, staring into the flames. "Will she be all right?" I asked quietly, meaning Eleanor. "She will heal," he said, "now that the shadow has lifted. But what a price, Hastings. What a terrible price we pay for silence." Eleanor did not speak for a long time after Cora Blake was taken away. She stood beside the fireplace, arms wrapped about herself as though chilled by something internal that no hearth could warm. Poirot watched her with quiet gravity, then stepped forward, offering her a small chair by the fire. She sat down slowly, as though every movement had to be considered. "I thought it would bring peace," she said, not looking at us. "Writing it out, confessing, even if it wasn't true." Poirot nodded. "There are truths of the mind, mademoiselle, and truths of the heart. Sometimes they do not agree, but the burden is no lighter when one carries the wrong one." She gave a hollow laugh. "But that's just it. I wanted to believe I'd done it. Isn't that mad? Because then, at least, it was over. I could understand it, explain it. What Julian did, what Cora did, that's much worse. It was premeditated, even if only for a moment." Poirot gently corrected her. "What Monsieur Cavendish did was conceal. What Mademoiselle Blake did was act out of passion, but what you did, Miss Forsyth, was absorb all the pain that should have been shared. And that, perhaps, was the most tragic act of all." She blinked rapidly, but said nothing more. Poirot let the silence settle like snow. Later, when the house had quieted again and Eleanor had retired, Poirot and I retired to the small salon where he often liked to sit and reflect after solving a case. He placed his fingers together beneath his chin and leaned back, his eyes half-lidded in thought. "I do not believe," he said slowly, "that we have yet reached the final page of this mystery." I started. "But surely, Poirot," Cora Blake confessed. "Julian corroborated it. The threats to Eleanor, Payne's murder, it all points to her." "Just so," Poirot agreed. "Too much so." I frowned. "You think she's innocent?" "No, but I do not think she acted alone." I was startled by the suggestion. Who would have helped her? Poirot's gaze flicked toward the fire. "Someone who stood to gain. Someone who had reason to be rid of Payne, and who understood that the manuscript was more dangerous than anyone realized." "But Cavendish?" Poirot shook his head. "He is a man of secrets, yes, but he lacks cunning. His guilt is of a different flavor, heavy, emotional. The killing of Payne was surgical, efficient, a methodical removal of a liability. That is not Cavendish." I pondered this in silence. Poirot rose, fetched a slim notebook from his valise, and thumbed through his earlier notes. "There is a name that has gone unnoticed, a presence in the house, but always at the periphery." "Ridley," I guessed. Poirot looked at me keenly. "Just so. Edwin Ridley, the critic, quiet, observant, and always with a cigarette and an arched brow of ironic detachment. It had not escaped my notice that he had been present for nearly every major conversation, and yet had revealed very little about himself. He was very close to Leonard Payne, Poirot murmured. Professionally and, I think, financially. They worked together on adaptations. Payne had written screenplays under a pseudonym, some quite successful, I hear. "And Ridley?" I asked. "He brokered the deals? Received a tidy cut, no doubt. If the manuscript had come to light, implicating Payne, it would not only have been a scandal, it might have cast doubt on all their prior works. Perhaps even copyright fraud." I sat forward, fascinated. So Payne reading the manuscript meant potential ruin for both of them. Exactly. And unlike Cora, Ridley is cold, calculated. If he suspected that Payne might turn the manuscript over to the authorities or to the press, he would act. Quietly. Decisively. Poirot tapped the notebook. Tomorrow we speak with him. But tonight, we observe. The next morning, Ridley was nowhere to be found at breakfast. Poirot, seemingly unconcerned, took his tea with unhurried elegance, then suggested a walk through the gardens. I followed him down the dew-soaked path toward the west lawn, where the ornamental yew hedges provided privacy and long sight lines. Ideal, Poirot noted, for watching and being watched. We found Ridley by the stone fountain, tossing breadcrumbs to the koi in the water below. He turned, smiled with polite detachment. Ah, the famous detective and his companion. Come to collect the final bow. Poirot gave a half-smile. Not yet, monsieur. I wish to ask you about your association with Monsieur Payne. Ridley's smile remained, but I detected a shift in his stance. Leonard and I worked together, yes. I edited some of his early work. We collaborated now and again. You profited from these collaborations. Modestly, he said, waving a hand. He had the talent. I had the contacts. And did you find Miss Forsyth's manuscript troubling? Ridley's gaze narrowed. Troubling? No. Implausible, perhaps. Melodramatic. It reads like a woman trying to expiate imagined guilt. Yet it led to Leonard's death, Poirot said mildly. Ridley scoffed. Hardly. Leonard had enemies. He liked to dig into people's pasts and use it for leverage. He likely pushed the wrong button. And yet, Poirot said, he died before he could return to London, before he could sell the manuscript or publish an exposé. Curious timing, non? Ridley's face hardened. Are you accusing me? Not at all, monsieur. I'm merely observing the symmetry of your association, and the silence that follows the deaths of men like Leonard Payne is often too convenient. With that, Poirot bid him good day and walked on. As soon as we were out of earshot, he whispered, He is afraid. He hides it behind sarcasm, but the fear is there. Then what do we do? Poirot smiled. We wait for him to make a mistake. That evening, Poirot excused himself early and retreated to the study. I returned to my room, only to be roused sometime after midnight by the sound of hushed voices in the hall. I cracked the door just in time to see a shadowy figure slipping into the library where Eleanor's manuscript had been locked away. I roused Poirot immediately. Within moments, we were gliding silently down the corridor. Poirot paused only once to retrieve something from a drawer in the side table. A small vial and a handkerchief. He motioned for silence, then opened the library door without a sound. Inside, Ridley stood before the locked cabinet, tools in hand. He turned with a start, eyes wide. Looking for something? Poirot asked. Ridley dropped the tools. I was only curious. Curiosity, Poirot said mildly, is natural. But breaking and entering, that is a sign of desperation. Ridley's calm cracked. It's a lie. That manuscript, it's fiction. It could destroy careers, reputations, mine included. So you killed Payne to stop him from using it? Ridley's face twisted. He was going to use it, blackmail Eleanor, or worse, leak it and tie my name to the whole sordid affair. I couldn't let that happen. Poirot nodded slowly. And you let Cora take the blame. Clever, but not clever enough. He stepped forward and, with practiced ease, pressed the cloth to Ridley's hand. A little test, monsieur, Poirot murmured, for powder residue. Ridley paled. You have nothing. Oh, but I do, Poirot replied. Your fingerprints on the wine glass you offered Payne, the same glass in which you dissolved a fast-acting cardiac agent, identical to the one found in his bloodstream. Ridley staggered back, defeated. He was going to ruin everything. I had no choice. There is always a choice, Poirot said. and with that, the second veil fell from the mystery, leaving only clarity in its wake. Ridley sat hunched in the drawing-room, his composure eroded to a tight-jawed silence. Gone was the ironic detachment, the quipping condescension, now replaced with raw, cornered calculation. Poirot regarded him from the opposite chair, hands steepled under his chin, while I remained in the background, marveling once more at how methodically my friend peeled back the layers of deceit. "I would not speak further without a solicitor," Ridley said finally, voice clipped. Poirot nodded agreeably. "Ah, but of course, Monsieur Ridley. That is your right, and you are not yet under arrest. Not quite. Scotland Yard will arrive in due time. Until then, you are merely a guest, n'est-ce pas?" The critic's eyes flickered to the closed door, as though calculating whether a sudden dash might offer him freedom. Poirot, observing this, smiled faintly. "You will find that Inspector Grant is stationed just outside. I anticipated your nerves, you understand." Ridley slumped back into the chair, defeated. Poirot turned to me. "Hastings, my friend, would you be so good as to fetch Mademoiselle Forsyth? I believe the time for our little gathering has come." I left without a word, heart thudding as I crossed the silent corridor. The manor seemed cloaked in a strange calm now, like the hush before a storm's second wave. I found Eleanor in the morning room, seated beside the window where the garden roses pressed faintly against the pane. She looked up at me, brows faintly raised. "He's confessed, hasn't he?" she asked. I hesitated. "He's admitted enough. Poirot wishes you to join us." She rose without protest and followed me back. In the drawing room, Julian Cavendish and Cora Blake were already present, summoned earlier by Poirot through swift, quiet messages. Ridley refused to meet their eyes as Eleanor entered and stood beside the fireplace. Poirot stood last of all, taking position before the hearth, his presence commanding without theatrics. "My friends," he began, "you have each played a role in this tangled affair. Some out of fear, others out of guilt, and at least one," his gaze rested on Ridley, "out of cold calculation." He began pacing gently before the hearth, hands clasped behind his back. "Let us return briefly to the sequence of events. Mademoiselle Forsyth writes a novel she believes is private, cathartic. It finds its way to Leonard Payne, a man ever hungry for leverage, and he sees in it a weapon. Perhaps he intended to blackmail her, perhaps merely to discredit her for profit. Eleanor looked down, her lips compressed. "Now we have Mademoiselle Blake," Poirot continued, "who learns of this and, whether in defense of Eleanor or to protect Cavendish, strikes Payne, a foolish, impulsive act, but not fatal. You see, Payne survived the initial blow." Cora flinched, staring at Poirot in disbelief. "Yes, mademoiselle. You left him unconscious, bleeding, but alive. It was someone else who ensured he would not wake. Someone who feared what Payne might still do if he recovered." All eyes turned to Ridley. "Mr. Ridley was in a position to observe all the pieces," Poirot said. "He knew about Payne's habits, his dealings. He knew the contents of the manuscript. He likely saw Cora enter Payne's room, and later, while the household slept, he slipped in and administered a poison, traced later in the empty glass, ensuring Payne's silence." Ridley's voice was low and bitter. He was a parasite. He would have turned on all of us eventually. Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, but monsieur, murder is not the solution to unpleasant colleagues." Julian stepped forward then, pale and shaking. "Why didn't you come to me, Ridley? We could have destroyed the manuscript, handled Payne." Ridley let out a snort. "You? You were too busy brooding over your own secrets, and she—" he nodded at Eleanor, "was wallowing in guilt she hadn't earned. I had no intention of letting everything I'd worked for go up in smoke over some sentimental nonsense." Poirot raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "And then, mademoiselle," he said, turning to Eleanor, "the threats began." She looked startled. "You mean Ridley?" Poirot gave a small nod. Indeed, it was not enough to silence pain. Ridley needed the manuscript suppressed, destroyed. And so, he began the campaign of fear. Letters, broken ornaments, a figure outside the window. Nothing too overt, just enough to suggest danger. You wanted her to destroy it herself, I realized aloud. Ridley didn't deny it. And she nearly did, until you arrived. Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Alas, monsieur, the little grey cells do not sleep when danger is near. He turned to the others. Now that the truth is known, it falls to the authorities. I have spoken to Inspector Grant. He has more than enough to act. 2 uniformed officers entered at that precise moment, as if summoned by Poirot's timing alone. Ridley rose, but offered no resistance. As he passed Eleanor, he paused, his expression unreadable. "It could have been fiction," he murmured. "You never should have written it." She looked him in the eye. "It was the truth. That's why it mattered." And then he was gone, escorted into the night. There was silence for a moment longer. Then Julian collapsed into a chair and ran a hand over his face. "It's over." Poirot did not sit. He turned to Eleanor one last time. "There is one more truth, mademoiselle, that you must know." Her eyes searched his face. "You blamed yourself for not seeing what your sister suffered, for surviving, but it was not your fault. Pain wears many masks, and you, like most, were not trained to look behind them. Guilt, when misapplied, becomes a prison. You must forgive yourself, or you remain a victim long after the crime." She nodded slowly, tears welling. "Thank you." Poirot offered a faint bow, then turned toward me. "Come, Hastings. I believe we have earned a return to London, and perhaps a quiet evening without murder." "Do such things exist in your world, Poirot?" I asked as we retrieved our coats. He smiled, that peculiar blend of modesty and pride etched into his features. "They do, but they are always short-lived. Come, my friend, the train awaits." And with that, the last chapter of a strange layered tale closed, not with a bang, but with the soft, undeniable sound of truth settling into place. As dawn broke over the countryside, the manor stood in a hush that felt deeper than mere silence. The events of the previous night had left an indelible mark on its inhabitants, each grappling with the revelations in their own way. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, and the usual morning routines proceeded with a subdued solemnity. Poirot, ever the early riser, sat in the breakfast room, his gaze fixed on the window where the first rays of sunlight filtered through. The quiet clink of his spoon against the teacup was the only sound, a rhythmic counterpoint to the stillness. Eleanor entered, her steps hesitant. She paused upon seeing Poirot, then offered a tentative smile. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot." He looked up, his eyes softening. "Mademoiselle Forsyth, please join me." She took a seat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Poirot inclined his head. "It was my duty, but tell me, how are you feeling?" Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Relieved, I suppose. And yet there's a weight that hasn't lifted." "Understandable," Poirot said gently. "Closure is a process, not an event." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Julian Cavendish. He looked between them, his expression unreadable. "May I join you?" "Of course," Eleanor said, gesturing to the seat beside her. Julian sat down, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "I've been thinking about the manuscript. What should be done with it?" Eleanor's eyes met his. "I don't know. Part of me wants to destroy it, to put it all behind us. But another part feels it should be preserved, as a testament to the truth." Poirot sipped his tea thoughtfully. "The decision is yours, but consider this. The manuscript is a piece of history, a reflection of events that shaped lives. Erasing it won't change what happened." Julian nodded slowly. Perhaps you're right." The trio sat in contemplative silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Later that day, as the sun reached its zenith, Poirot and I prepared to depart. Our bags were packed, and the car awaited us at the front of the manor. Eleanor approached us, a small parcel in her hands. "Monsieur Poirot, I wanted you to have this." He took the parcel, unwrapping it to reveal a leather-bound notebook. "Your manuscript?" She nodded. "I made a copy. I thought you might find it useful." Poirot smiled warmly. "Thank you, mademoiselle. I shall treat it with the utmost care." As we stepped into the car, I glanced back at the manor. Its imposing facade stood as a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded within its walls. Poirot settled into his seat, the notebook resting on his lap. "Another case closed, Hastings." I chuckled. "Indeed, though I must say this one was particularly intricate." He nodded. "Human emotions often complicate matters, but in the end, the truth prevails." As the car pulled away, the manor receded into the distance, its secrets laid bare, its occupants left to rebuild their lives amidst the echoes of the past. The ride to London was quiet, the countryside slipping past our windows in a blur of autumn color. Poirot had remained uncharacteristically introspective, his gaze never straying far from the leather-bound copy of Eleanor's manuscript resting on his lap. Though the case appeared concluded, Ridley arrested, motives exposed, and Eleanor finally beginning to emerge from the shadow of her past, there was a subtle tension still coiled in Poirot's manner. Something unfinished, though I could not quite place what. Finally, after nearly an hour of silence, he spoke. "Hastings, mon ami, do you recall what Ridley said just before his arrest?" I thought for a moment. "Yes. He said Eleanor should never have written it, that it could have been fiction." Poirot nodded slowly. "Just so. And yet Ridley was a man of precision. He chose his words carefully. What does one infer, Hastings, from that particular phrase?" "That it wasn't fiction?" I asked, uncertain. "Exactement. That it was not merely based on truth, but truth itself." Poirot tapped the notebook. "And what else might that imply?" I gave him a sideways look. "Are you suggesting there's more in that manuscript than we assumed? Something we overlooked?" He offered a small smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "Let us say, I believe we have solved the crime as it happened, but perhaps we have not yet fully understood the why." That, I confess, puzzled me. Ridley's motive had been self-preservation, clear and coherent. Eleanor had written a novel implicating herself in a long-buried tragedy. Payne, ever the opportunist, saw a means of profit. Ridley acted to suppress it. The logic held. Still, Poirot was not one to harbor vague suspicions without reason. Back in London, we returned to Poirot's flat on Whitehaven Mansions. The familiar surroundings, his immaculate desk, the gleaming silver ornaments, the geometric harmony of his belongings, seemed to ease some invisible weight from his shoulders. He placed the notebook on the desk, opened it with care, and began to read anew. I left him to it, sensing that now was not the time to intrude. It was late afternoon when he finally looked up, having turned the last page. "Well?" I prompted. "There is a difference, Hastings, between what a writer intends to reveal and what they reveal unknowingly," Poirot said quietly. "I don't follow." "Eleanor's manuscript, though framed as fiction, is a confession, but not in the way we believed." I stepped closer, frowning. "You mean she didn't kill her sister?" "No, Hastings. She did not, but I believe she witnessed something. Something she never consciously admitted, not even to herself. The truth seeped through in her writing, between the lines, as it were." I picked up the notebook, flipping through it aimlessly. "But we've read this before. She talks about the night of the drowning, the argument, her feelings of guilt. It's all very emotional, but..." Look again at the scene by the lake, Poirot interrupted, rising. She describes the water, the path through the trees, the scent of lilac, all very vivid. But there is one small detail that recurs several times. A silver bracelet. Her sister wore it always. Yes, I remember. And yet, Poirot said softly, Eleanor describes seeing the bracelet at the top of the steps, before the body was found. I stared at him. So it fell off? No, Hastings. That is just it. The bracelet did not fall. Eleanor wrote of it lying neatly on the top step, arranged as though placed. My mind whirred. So someone else was there. Someone who killed her sister, then placed the bracelet. Poirot gave a grave nod. And Eleanor saw it. She must have. But whether out of shock or a willful desire not to see, she buried that knowledge deep within herself. Until she wrote the book. And therein lies the true confession, not of guilt, but of witness. We sat in silence for a long moment. Poirot continued, I believe there is someone else who had a motive, someone who has been in the periphery. We must revisit our cast, Hastings. But surely we're past that, I said. Ridley confessed. He poisoned Payne. Cora struck the blow, though not fatal. Eleanor wrote the book. Who else is left? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but that is where the story becomes interesting again, mon ami. Who would benefit most from both Payne's death and the suppression of the manuscript? Not out of fear, but out of opportunity. I frowned, thinking. Julian Cavendish. But he seemed distracted, yes, and fearful. But not of the truth, of exposure. He was the publisher. The manuscript could have jeopardized his reputation, and perhaps, more importantly, it could have revealed that he knew of the sister's abuse, that he had turned a blind eye, perhaps even facilitated a silence. Are you suggesting he was the one who killed Eleanor's sister? Poirot raised a hand. No, but I suggest he may have known who did, and protected them. I froze. Who, then? Poirot picked up the telephone. Hastings, I believe it is time we invited Mademoiselle Blake to London. There are still some questions to be answered, and I believe she too has buried truths. The call was brief, and Poirot's tone polite. An invitation, not an interrogation. He rang off and turned to me. The lies, Hastings, are layered like a millefeuille. We must gently peel them back. By the following afternoon, Cora Blake arrived at Whitehaven Mansions. She was composed, though her eyes flicked nervously about the sitting room. Miss Blake, Poirot said with his usual elegance, thank you for coming. I was curious, she said. You sounded as though things weren't finished? In a sense, Poirot said. I wished to speak not about the murder of Leonard Payne, but about the earlier tragedy, Eleanor's sister. Cora's lips thinned. That was ruled an accident. Perhaps. But you were close to her, and I suspect you knew more than you said. She hesitated, then sat down. She was fragile. We all knew it, but no one spoke of why. Poirot leaned forward. You wrote a letter once, to Julian Cavendish, expressing concern about what you witnessed. He burned it. Cora's eyes widened. How did you know? He told me. And that, Miss Blake, is what troubles me. Julian destroyed the evidence, suppressed the manuscript, distanced himself from the facts. And yet I wonder, was it fear or guilt? Cora's hands trembled slightly in her lap. You think he killed her? I think, Poirot said gently, that he may have allowed it to happen, or known who did. She looked down, silent. Poirot pressed on. You can still protect the living, Miss Blake, but not by guarding the dead. Cora raised her eyes, brimming with unshed tears. It wasn't Julian. It was their father. The words hung in the air. He was cruel, she continued. Controlling. Eleanor never knew the worst of it, but her sister, she tried to leave once. The father followed her. That night by the lake, he returned furious. She was terrified. Poirot exhaled slowly. And he pushed her? I don't know, but she never came back. Julian found her. He buried the truth. I sat, stunned. Poirot, however, simply nodded. The final piece, he said quietly. Thank you, mademoiselle. As Cora left, Poirot turned to me. So you see, Hastings, the death of Leonard Payne was the consequence of a chain begun long before. The sins of the past always find a way to surface. Eleanor's manuscript was not a confession of guilt, but an act of unknowing exhumation. He picked up the notebook once more, holding it as one might hold a holy relic. Words, my friend, are often more dangerous than weapons. And for the first time since the case began, I saw in Poirot's eyes not satisfaction, but sorrow. Poirot's apartment remained still after Miss Blake's departure. The ticking of the mantel clock, the only sound as the final shadows of dusk crept across the room. I sat, fingers steepled beneath my chin, reflecting on what we had just heard. Though the immediate mystery, the death of Leonard Payne, had found its resolution, a darker, older truth had emerged from the depths. It hung in the air like a faint mist, unshakable and cold. Poirot remained seated, elbows on the arms of his chair, fingertips pressed together in thought. At last, he stirred. You understand now, Hastings, why the confession Eleanor wrote was not what it seemed. It was not the account of a crime she committed, but the echo of one she witnessed and did not comprehend. I nodded slowly. And her guilt was misplaced, he said, though no less real to her. Guilt is a curious thing, mon ami. It does not always follow the rules of logic. A child feels guilt for a parent's anger. A witness feels culpability for not having intervened. Eleanor believed herself complicit in her sister's death, not because she caused it, but because she survived it. I found myself shivering despite the warmth of the room. And Julian Cavendish, he protected the memory of the family, covered it all up. To his own detriment, Poirot said. He enabled silence when truth was needed. Yet perhaps it was not cowardice alone. Perhaps he hoped to preserve something, the illusion of dignity, of legacy. A long pause passed between us. Will you go to the police? I asked finally. Poirot looked up at me with a weary smile. There is little to report. The father is long dead. The case of Leonard Payne is closed. Cora Blake has spoken her truth, and Eleanor, she has suffered more than justice could demand. No, Hastings. Sometimes, to preserve balance, one must allow certain ghosts to sleep. There was something poetic in that, something I could not quite argue against. It was the following morning when a final twist presented itself. Not by some orchestrated design of Poirot's, but by a letter delivered by post. Poirot read it in silence before handing it to me. The handwriting was careful, the ink dark and deliberate. Monsieur Poirot, I have heard that you uncovered truths no one else dared speak. I wish to thank you. I knew something had happened all those years ago, something unspoken in the family. Eleanor would never say, but there was a hollowness in her afterward, as though the light in her had been quietly extinguished. I think she believed no one would ever understand. You did. She's resting now, quietly. The manuscript is with her lawyer, who intends to publish it. Unedited. She would have liked that. Yours, Cora Blake. I set the letter down slowly. Poirot was already standing by the window, arms crossed, eyes distant. She will publish it, I asked. She will, he replied. And the world will read a fiction that is more truthful than many facts. A silence passed. Will it expose the family? I asked. Poirot nodded faintly. To those who know how to read it, yes. But more importantly, it will exonerate Eleanor. Not with a court ruling, but with understanding. His tone softened. That, Hastings, is the justice she needed. It was not long after that we were invited to the official conclusion of the Payne case, a gathering held in a modest chamber at Scotland Yard. where Chief Inspector Morland delivered the final report. Ridley had confessed to poisoning Leonard Payne after discovering the publication plans for the manuscript. He admitted to forging notes between Eleanor and Payne, stoking paranoia to ensure her mental collapse, and administering the poison through his own hand-delivered wine, masked with a dose of syrup. Cora Blake had indeed struck Payne during a scuffle, but the blow had not been fatal. Ridley's confession absolved her. The press reported it succinctly. Famed author's confession uncovered in fiction. Publicist arrested in poison plot. Only Poirot and I, and a very few others, knew the full shape of the truth. As we left the yard, I glanced at Poirot. "You know, I'm not sure what's more remarkable, that you uncovered the murderer or that you understood the heart of it all." Poirot gave me a sideways look, one of those proud but subtly amused expressions he so often reserved for moments of victory. "You are kind, Hastings, but it is not remarkable. It is simply this. One must listen not just to what is said, but to what is not. One must see not just with the eyes, but with the heart, the psychology. It is always the key." We walked on in companionable silence until Whitehaven Mansions came into view. Autumn had deepened in London. Golden leaves fluttered down to the pavement, brushing our coats as we passed. Poirot paused at the steps, glancing up at the grey sky. "It is finished, then?" I asked. He considered a moment, then smiled faintly. "It is never quite finished, Hastings, but for now, the order is restored." We stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby a welcome contrast to the chill outside. I knew he would retreat to his study to polish his cufflinks or rearrange his orchid pots, rituals that gave him comfort in the aftermath of human drama. I followed him to the door, lingering just a moment. "There will be more, won't there?" I asked. "More murders, more puzzles." Poirot turned back. "Yes, my friend, always. But for each, we shall be ready." With that, he tipped his head, the smallest bow of gratitude, and disappeared into his apartment. I walked back through the London streets with a sense of calm. The case of Eleanor Blake had been unlike others, not for its violence, but for its quiet, enduring sorrow. Yet Poirot, with his little grey cells and immense compassion, had uncovered not just a murderer, but a story buried under years of silence. And somewhere, in a modest publishing house, a book waited to go to print, a novel that would tell the world what Eleanor had never been able to say aloud. I smiled to myself, hearing Poirot's voice in memory. "The truth, mon ami, will always find a way to speak." A week had passed since the resolution of the case, and I believed the matter to be truly concluded. Poirot, however, seemed preoccupied, subtle in his distraction, as always, but to one who knew him well, the signs were unmistakable. He spent long hours in silent contemplation, toying not with crime scene photographs or letters, but with a single object, a small, unassuming photograph of Eleanor Blake in her youth, taken with her sister Cecilia. It had arrived enclosed in Cora Blake's final letter, a token of memory, perhaps, or perhaps something more. I remarked upon his stillness one afternoon as he sat at his desk. The sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in fine diagonal lines across the floor. "You've not moved in half an hour," I said lightly. "For a man with no case to occupy him, you seem terribly consumed." Poirot's eyes flickered to me. "Non, mon ami, you are mistaken. It is precisely because there is no case that I must work harder. The mind, it must not be idle." I raised an eyebrow. "So you're inventing a case?" He smiled faintly. "No, I am completing one." The phrase hung in the air a moment before I understood. "You mean the Blake affair?" He inclined his head slightly. "There are still loose threads." But Ridley confessed. The police were satisfied. Even Cora wrote to thank you. "Oui," Poirot murmured. "But the truth, Hastings, is like a fine tapestry. You may see the picture, but if one thread is out of place, the entire structure feels wrong. I waited patiently, knowing Poirot would reveal his thoughts in his own time. He did so with measured precision. You recall, of course, the forged notes that Ridley used to manipulate Eleanor, the letters between her and Payne. Of course, Ridley admitted to writing them. Poirot tapped the photograph. And yet the language, Hastings, the style of those notes, it was too precise, too literary, even for a clever publicist. I frowned. You believe someone helped him? I believe someone else may have originated them, Poirot said softly, or at the very least, inspired them. My mind turned through the list of suspects, now dispersed. Julian Cavendish had returned to the countryside, reportedly unwell. Cora Blake had gone back to her small publishing house in Cambridge. The housekeeper, Mrs. Selby, had vanished from the narrative entirely once the police ruled out domestic involvement. Who then? I asked. Poirot leaned back. That is the question, and there is one further matter. The manuscript. What of it? It was never published. Cora Blake wrote that it would be. But a week has passed, and the solicitor she named, a Mr. Fulbright, claims no such document was ever delivered. I sat up straighter. You think someone intercepted it? Poirot did not answer immediately. He rose instead and walked to the fireplace, gazing into the dark hearth. Eleanor's manuscript was not only a confession, it was a key. It contained details that had never been revealed publicly, yet matched closely to certain elements Ridley exploited in his forgeries. And so I asked myself, how did Ridley know? How did he know that Eleanor had always believed herself a silent witness to her sister's death? That she had considered it her fault? I stared at him. You think someone read the manuscript before her death? He turned. I do, and not just anyone. Someone who used it. There was silence between us then, broken only by the rustle of the wind against the window pane. I could see that familiar gleam in Poirot's eye, a tightening of focus that meant the case, far from being concluded, had only shifted into a deeper, more perilous phase. That evening, we made our way to Cambridge. Poirot had arranged a discreet meeting with Cora Blake, requesting it with the utmost politeness, but also with that firm finality that no one refused. She met us in her office, narrow, high-ceilinged, lined with books and posters of obscure novels from the interwar period. She appeared nervous, though she masked it well. "I'm surprised to see you again, Monsieur Poirot," she said, offering tea that he declined with a courteous wave of the hand. Poirot got directly to the point. "The manuscript, Mademoiselle Blake. You wrote that it would be published, that Mr. Fulbright held the rights, yet he claims he never received it." Her brows furrowed. "That's impossible. I gave it to him myself, sealed. He came to collect it the day after Eleanor's funeral." Poirot tilted his head. "Are you certain it was he?" She blinked. "Well, yes. He had identification. I've met him before. He handled Eleanor's estate." "Would you mind," Poirot said gently, "if I telephone Mr. Fulbright now? You will see it is not a trick." She hesitated, then nodded. Poirot made the call, holding the receiver at an angle that allowed us to hear Fulbright's voice. Surprised, polite, utterly sincere. "I've not been to Cambridge in months," the solicitor said. "Certainly not since the funeral. And I've not laid eyes on Miss Blake in even longer." When Poirot hung up, the room fell into a thick silence. "Then who?" Cora began. But Poirot was already at the bookshelf, fingers scanning spines until he pulled out a slim blue volume. "A 1931 edition of The Silent Will," he murmured. "Not very popular, but obscure, like many of the references in the forged letters." He turned to face her. "Miss Blake, who else had access to the manuscript? Before it was sealed?" Her voice was a whisper. "Only me." "And who else helped you at the press?" You said you prepared the submission yourself, but typesetting, layout, legal review? I did have help from my assistant. Richard Mayhew. Poirot's eyes glinted. Ah, that is a name I've heard before. He was once employed by Julian Cavendish, was he not? A brief tenure assisting with archival work. Her eyes widened. Ridley may have been the hand, Poirot said softly. But Mayhew was the mind. He knew the manuscript's contents. He recognized their power. I believe it was he who supplied Ridley with those ideas. Perhaps even forged the notes, and when Ridley was arrested, Mayhew vanished from sight. Cora's face had turned pale. You must report this, she said. Poirot bowed his head. I already have. Scotland Yard is searching for him, but I wish to speak with you first. Because, Mademoiselle Blake, he may try to silence the truth once more. If he believes you suspect him, you are in danger. She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words. Outside, the sun had faded entirely, the streetlights flickering on. Poirot stood in the doorway as we prepared to leave, his silhouette cast long against the hallway. One more thing, he said. Do not fear. The manuscript will be found. I have a feeling it was never destroyed. Men like Mayhew. He paused. They treasure knowledge, even when it damns them. We stepped into the cold night, the wind sharp with the bite of winter on its edge. The chase was not yet over, but the threads were tightening. A new player had emerged from the shadows. One who knew too much, had read too deeply, and had used truth as a weapon. Beside me, Poirot was already forming his next move. The final game had begun. The following morning found us back in London, the mist curling low around the buildings as though reluctant to relinquish the secrets buried beneath the cobbled streets. Poirot had barely slept, rising early with a briskness that belied his age, his moustache immaculate, his attire precise. The lines of thought etched into his face had only deepened since our visit to Cambridge. Mayhew is not a man of impulse, Hastings, he said as we sat together in the breakfast room of Whitehaven Mansions. He is deliberate. His disappearance was not panic, it was preparation. I sipped my coffee, watching Poirot pace with the energy of a man chasing an invisible adversary. But what is he preparing for? Surely if he has the manuscript, he knows it's only a matter of time before he's found. Poirot stopped, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. Ah, but therein lies the psychology. Mon ami. Mayhew does not think of himself as a criminal. He thinks of himself as the curator of a great truth, a historian. And the manuscript? It is to him a rare artifact. He will hide it, not destroy it. He may even believe he has preserved something noble. I raised an eyebrow. That seems warped. But not uncommon in men who traffic in secrets, Poirot replied. And this belief, this vanity, it gives us a path to follow. We began our search not with the police, who were still combing Ridley's last known addresses and Mayhew's former lodgings, but with the literary underground. Small antiquarian dealers, specialty shops, and private libraries frequented by the more esoteric corners of the publishing world. It was slow, tedious work, but Poirot pressed on with his usual unfailing precision, always asking the same types of questions in that same courteous tone. Had they seen Richard Mayhew? Had any rare manuscripts changed hands recently, especially anonymous ones? Late in the afternoon, our diligence bore fruit. At a tiny bookshop tucked into a side street near Bloomsbury, an elderly woman with a smoker's rasp and spectacles as thick as glass-bottomed jars mentioned a curious incident. Bit of a strange one he was. Thin fellow, anxious eyes. Came in about a week ago asking if we handled private papers. Said he had something sensitive. Didn't give a name, just initials. RM. Weren't interested in selling, though. Just wanted to know if we had secure storage. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did you? Oh, no, she said with a wheezing chuckle. Told him if it was that sensitive, he'd best try someplace with a vault. Then he left, didn't buy a thing. Poirot nodded. And did he say where he was staying? No, but he asked about the university archive nearby. Gave me the impression he was headed that way. The moment we stepped back onto the street, Poirot hailed a cab with uncommon urgency. To the University of London archives, if you please. Once there, Poirot presented a fabricated story with just enough truth to sound plausible, that he was following a research trail linked to an obscure literary manuscript of a defunct author, and that a man matching Mayhew's description might have recently inquired about depositing private documents. The clerk, a bright young man with ink-stained fingers and an earnest air, nodded after a moment's thought. Yes, I believe someone fitting that description came by. He was curious about anonymous deposits. Said he was acting on behalf of a reclusive client. Very nervous. Poirot leaned in slightly. Did he leave anything? The young man hesitated, glancing about before lowering his voice. Technically, no. But we found something this morning in one of the private research lockers. We were going to log it with lost property. It was odd. Poirot's voice took on a velvet softness. May I see it? The young man looked over his shoulder, then beckoned us down a corridor and into a side room. There, atop a plain wooden table, lay a thick manuscript bound in red ribbon, the pages yellowed only slightly at the edges. The title page was written in a careful hand, The Confession of Eleanor Blake. Poirot did not touch it at once. He simply stared at it for a long moment, as though committing its very presence to memory. And no one else has seen this? He asked. No, sir. Not yet. Then let us keep it so, for the moment. He thanked the clerk, who returned to his desk, clearly bewildered. Poirot, still calm, finally picked up the manuscript and leafed through it carefully. I watched the transformation in his face, a deepening gravity, a quiet understanding forming behind his eyes. She wrote everything, Hastings. Not just about Cecilia's death, but about the guilt she carried, the way Ridley manipulated her, and, yes, here it is. He turned the page toward me. Eleanor mentions sharing a draft of the manuscript with her publisher's assistant, Mayhew. She trusted him. She even called him her silent editor. I felt a chill. He had access, and he used it to ruin her. Poirot nodded. But more than that, he believed in the story. He was not merely opportunistic. He was devoted. And now he has hidden it here, perhaps hoping it might be discovered long after he's gone, or when he can no longer be held accountable. So what now? Now, Poirot said, eyes glinting, we set a trap. That evening, Poirot placed an advertisement in the literary review under a false name, posing as a collector interested in acquiring unique manuscripts by unpublished authors of psychological fiction. He referenced a particular phrase used only once in Eleanor's manuscript, the guilt of the witness is heavier than the hand that strikes, a phrase Poirot suspected Mayhew considered a signature. He will read it, Poirot said. He will believe someone has found the manuscript and understood it, and he will come. For 2 days, we waited. Poirot was uncharacteristically still, his mind fully occupied with the unfolding of the plan. On the 3rd day, a reply arrived, a handwritten note delivered to the review's offices. We share a burden. Meet me, midnight, Grosvenor Square, under the horse statue. Come alone. The note was unsigned. At 5 minutes to midnight, Poirot and I waited at a discreet distance from the statue. He had refused to let me accompany him to the rendezvous point itself, insisting I watch from across the road. The square was quiet, the lamps casting long shadows through the sparse trees. A figure approached, hunched against the cold. Mayhew. I could barely hear what passed between them, but I watched Poirot speak softly, gesturing not with menace, but with something closer to compassion. Mayhew's stance shifted. at first defiant, then crumbling. His shoulders slumped. After several minutes, Poirot led him back toward me. His face was pale and hollow-eyed, but he did not resist. "He has confessed," Poirot said. "Not to murder, but to theft, forgery, betrayal. He admits everything." Mayhew said nothing. He looked not at us, but at the ground, his lips parted slightly as if in prayer or shame. Later, as we sat in Poirot's flat once more, manuscript safe in hand, I asked him if he had pitied Mayhew. "Pity is not the word, mon ami," Poirot said quietly. But I understood him. The mind that distorts truth for meaning, it is a dangerous mind, but not always an evil one. He looked toward the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes. Eleanor Blake wrote a confession to free herself. Mayhew read it and saw a prophecy, but only one of them sought redemption. And with that, the matter was closed. The truth, long obscured, had been brought into the light, not with violence, but with reason, and the little gray cells, once again, had done their work.